right, hello everyone, and thank you so much for coming. So this event is part of Imperial's Sustainability Week, and today we're focusing on the theme of biodiversity. And so the point of this panel is to explore how we can look at solutions from tech, from finance, from policy, from ecology to halt biodiversity loss. And I'll be joined today by a wonderful crew of panelists, all who are doing research on this topic. So these are Richard Belcher, who's a postgrad at the School of Public Health, and he's interested in how green spaces affect our mental health. We'll have Stanislava Bošković, who is a research associate in civil and environmental engineering, and she's currently focused on increasing the resilience of urban ecosystems through nature-based solutions. We'll have Pernilla Holtedal, who is in the Imperial Business School at the Center for Climate Change and Finance, and she's an expert in nature investing. And then we'll hear from Halima Misal, who's a postgrad at the Center for Environmental Policy. Her research focuses on economic impacts of wildfires, but she's also going to talk about her experience at the 15th Biodiversity COP. So we're really excited to hear about that. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. So the event is being recorded. I'd ask you to turn off your phone just so we don't have anything interrupting the recording. Be aware of where the fire exits are for those of you in the room. You'll have an opportunity after the panelists speak to ask questions. If you're in the room, all you need to do is raise your hand, but we have an online portal for you to submit your questions to, and please feel free to tag us on social media. So thank you guys so much for coming. I'm Bonnie Waring. I'm a senior lecturer at the Grantham Institute on climate change. My expertise is on how the ecology of land ecosystems affects their capacity to take up carbon from the atmosphere. And so I spend a lot of time thinking about the big environmental challenges that we face. And I'm going to start our presentation just by sort of setting the stage. So we're talking about halting biodiversity loss. How bad is the problem currently? It's really hard to overstate the extent to which we have modified every aspect of our planet. So we've altered the chemistry of our soils, of our oceans, of our atmosphere. We're losing species at an alarming rate. We're turning up the planet's thermostat through climate change. There are so many facts and figures I could throw at you to summarize how massive this change that we have wrought is. Just to pull one at random. If you were to add up the weight of every cow, sheep, pig, and goat, all of the livestock we use to feed ourselves, their weight is 14 times greater than that of every wild mammal on the planet. We've transformed the distribution of ecological communities. So the diagram that I have here is something called the planetary boundaries framework. It's trying to understand what is the safe operating space for humanity? How far can we push these different aspects of the planet's system and still support ourselves? So I'm going to be focusing today on two perturbations to those planetary boundaries: loss of biodiversity and climate change. And the reason I'm focusing on these two is because these are actually two different facets of the same problem, as I'll explain. So you're probably aware that we are in a biodiversity crisis. We estimate that rates of species extinctions are probably 1,000 times higher than they were in the past. We can tell this by looking at rates of species extinction in the fossil record. This has been happening since humans evolved, basically, but it's really accelerated approximately at the time the Industrial Revolution started. And it's not that just that species are going extinct. So even in populations of plants and animals that are nowhere near extinction, there are fewer of them than there were in the past. So we estimate that there are 70% fewer wild animals on our planet today than there were 50 years ago. At the same time, the environment in which those plants and animals live is changing. So almost everyone is probably familiar with this graph on the top. This is global temperature rise from the start of the Industrial Revolution up until now. And the bottom shows what's causing that temperature rise. It's our emissions of greenhouse gases. which over the same period of time have accelerated and continue to do so. Now, I said climate and biodiversity loss are linked. That's because they share a common driver. So this graph at the top is showing the causes of the extinctions that we've observed so far. There are various causes, but usually the biggest one is habitat loss, conversion of forest or grassland or peatland into agricultural use. This is the same graph of greenhouse gas emissions I showed you before, but now I'm going to point out the yellow part of this graph is emissions from land use change. So when we convert habitat, we are also causing the carbon held in that habitat's soils and vegetation to be released to the atmosphere. So climate change and biodiversity loss share drivers, and unfortunately, they're reinforcing each other. So this is a very scary figure. It's showing an accumulation of all of the studies that have tried to estimate the relationship between warming and rates of species extinction. And gathering together all of this evidence, every study that's been done, what we predict is that if we allow warming to rise to 4 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, we will lose 1 in 6 species on our planet. This model predicts that we've lost about 2% of biodiversity due to the warming that's taken place so far. It's hard for us to keep track of species loss because actually we're describing new species all the time. We're losing things faster than we find them. And not just little bugs or uninteresting plants. I mean, we're still discovering new species of primate, of frogs, of lizard. However, the bright side of this is that if the causes of biodiversity loss and climate are linked, the solutions can be too. So if we can protect the natural habitats we have, if we can manage our agroecosystems better so that we can produce more food without converting new natural habitat into agricultural use, and if we can restore forests and grasslands and peatlands that were degraded in the past, we can sequester carbon and we can avert biodiversity loss. Now, there's one important message that I want to leave you with, and that is the overall trajectory that we're on of populations declining, species being lost. It's an overall pattern, but there's lots more going on underneath. So in this graph here, each row is a status on the IUCN Red List. At the top are species that we're not concerned about. On the bottom are species that are extinct. There's about 10,000 species of birds. These circles show birds that have changed in status over the past few decades. So for the majority, we see birds of least concern moving to threatened, vulnerable moving to endangered, and sadly, a few that have moved from critically endangered to extinct. But these green circles show species moving the other way. We've pulled some species back from the brink of extinction. We've moved some from vulnerable to less vulnerable. We can do it. We just need to switch which of these pathways is more predominant. So that being said, it's not just about biologists like myself going out and doing conservation. It's about the social, the financial, the bigger picture context in which these are sitting. And that's what my panelists are going to discuss. So I'd like to invite Richard up, and he's going to talk to us about his work on nature and mental health.
Thank you for the introduction. I appreciate that. So yeah, as Bonnie said, I'm presenting on why nature is so important to our mental well-being. So I think, generally speaking, most people appreciate the nature of mental health in this country. I think it's been covered in the media quite extensively in recent years. You can see a few examples of some popular news articles that you might have read yourself. I'll pick one up. There we go, perfect. Yeah, so as I said, it's been sort of widely covered in the media. I think what a lot of people don't realise is that there's a big sort of scientific evidence behind these sort of news articles, and up to thousands of pieces of research conducted looking at how natural environments can impact our mental health. I think it is intuitive in the UK. A lot of people go, walk to nature for stress relief or just to sort of relax. But what people don't know also is there's a long history of it too. So you can see really starting off in the Roman times, nature was being planned for our health and well-being. Moving forward to London, there was pleasures, a part for pleasure and freshness and health in the 1600s. And then the Garden City movement, moving on to more recent research, looking at experiments on stress reduction from natural environments. And then up to today, multidisciplinary approaches going from ecology to public health, all the way to urban planning and architecture, looking into this research topic. And from that, really multiple pathways from a natural environment experience all the way to mental health have been identified. So I'll go into those in a bit more detail. So it really starts off with being near nature, and generally this is more likely if it's closer to where you live. There's study showing that. So you have environmental improvements, sensory experience, exposure to more diverse microbiota, and that moves to sort of reduce stress, cognition, physical activity increases, and openness to socialize. And then from that, you get your mental health improvements. So you can see it's kind of a complex picture there. Some of the research is sort of more outcome-based. They might quantify green space near to where you live, and then also quantify your mental health and look at the correlations between the two. So more sort of observational studies, and there are other studies that are more pathway specific. There'll be randomized controlled trials and experiments where they put people in a more natural environment, and then also people in an urban environment, and compare the health outcomes as they're doing that. The relative importance of these pathways, I think, is kind of unclear. I think it's a real active area of research at the moment. Which ones should we think about as being more beneficial? And also, it really depends on other factors, the context, and other things that I could get into too as well. Just to say, I think it's also important how we think about nature aside from nature where we live. So, our connection to nature may be far away, like the Amazon, for example, like eco-anxiety, but I'm not going to focus on that today, but that is a really important aspect of how nature can impact our mental health. But each of those pathways I outlined kind of has different factors that impact the benefits. So you get like the environmental conditions nearby. So you might get sort of like road traffic pollution nearby to the green space that can impact the restorative properties it has and what person's experiencing it, maybe your own understanding of the nature itself, which I'll go into a bit more. The generalized socioeconomic status of the local area too, and the cultural conditions. And really importantly as well, the physical characteristics of the nature itself, so like the biodiversity, which I'll explain in more detail now, just as one example. Obviously, there's so many different parts of the research here that you can go into more detail, but I'll just focus on this one. So first, we'll talk a bit about mechanisms behind how biodiversity can sort of change those different pathways. So first of all, when you're in a more natural environment, more higher biodiverse environment, you generally have a high diversity of experiences. There are more things to see, to smell, to touch, and that can actually distract you and provide a sort of soft fascination and attention restoration, which has been shown in some research studies. More diverse habitats generally have a more diverse microbial community as well, and that's linked to immunoregulation, which has also impacted your mental health too. And then lastly, if you have a more biodiverse environment, generally you have a higher ecosystem functioning, more productivity, which is linked to ecosystem service provision, and that has downstream impacts on mental health through sort of improvements in the physical environment. So even things like preventing flooding can have downstream impacts on your mental health. So these are important things to consider. So what's the evidence base like for this, though, for this effect of biodiversity on mental health? So there's mixed results in the literature. There needs to be more studies that actually go into the final downstream mental health impacts of the environmental improvements. A lot of them will stop just at the flooding and not look at the subsequent impacts downstream on mental health. A review of 24 studies that was recently done in 2019 found that about half of the studies were positive. Most of these were looking at that sort of middle pathway of sensory experience. Half found no effect at all, and 2 were negative. But it's not all doom and gloom. I think a lot of that was to do with the statistical power of the studies. Generally, the research funding going into it, maybe they could have had a bigger sample size, they might have been able to detect something. I think there's more work needed in that area, to be honest. So where can we go for future research looking at nature and mental health? Well, obviously there's a large it's a large field, there's many different directions. The few things that I think will be quite important is, can improvements to existing green spaces give a short-term return on investment in terms of avoided costs? Really sort of bringing the cycle back round. I think we have a good evidence base for the benefits, but perhaps we need to like close that loop by looking at the actual investment cost in some of the solutions. I think especially in a land scarce country like the UK, where it's kind of hard to, there's not a lot of land use change happening here. So I think it's kind of important to improve what we already have. Some options are relatively cheap to establish as well. Like you can see here, wildflower meadows or allotment gardening. I think there's 200,000 plus people on the allotment waiting list in the UK at the moment. And there's sort of a lot of benefits associated with that for mental health. Obviously, it's important to consider who benefits more and are they accessible to those people and disadvantaged communities as well, which has been something that's been studied quite a lot. And also really to face up to the fact, is the gain worth it versus the other options? If we're going to be investing money in green spaces for mental health, is it better spent there or in other solutions? I think that's something that's really important to strengthen the support for it if it's worthwhile doing. And also, finally, a bit controversially, I think something that's worth discussing is, could NHS funding be directed for this purpose to reduce costs? So if it was found to be a cheaper option than other health interventions, could we use improving green spaces or creating more green spaces as a thing to improve our mental health, essentially? Thank you.
Hello. Thank you very much, Bonnie, for the introduction, and Richard for the fantastic presentation. Yes, sure. So yes, as it was said, the climate change phenomena are strongly influencing the urban infrastructure generally, and also the quality of life of citizens and the public health generally. So I would like to show you today the one project in particular, but just to let you know that our research group at Civil and Environmental Engineering is working on 2 European funded projects that are specifically focusing on improvement and enhancing of public health and well-being in cities. And today I will focus on the UPOLIS project. That is a multidisciplinary 4 years project focusing on a very concrete case studies in 4 different cities for proposing the new urban planning methodology for enhancing the public health and well-being. When I say it is multidisciplinary, it means that we have the experts from cities authorities like urban designers, planners, engineers, and everyone who is involved in urban planning processes, but also we have the experts in consortia that are focusing on providing the technology for monitoring the phenomena and monitoring the implementation, interventions of the implementation. And we have also academic partners like ourselves at Imperial College, but also the partners from medical discipline, medical experts that from the very beginning of design process are guiding us and helping us seeing the concrete issues that health can be connected with in the interventions of nature-based solution we are dealing with. So it's very precious link or lenses that we have from the very beginning, not as an addition, but from the very beginning of the design process. Many cities that we're here concentrating on 4, but we can say that many cities are shared problems in their functioning of infrastructure linked to urban heat island or other phenomena linked to the climate change. But our project has a very specific approach through the detailed analysis of the context, because we believe that even if the issues and the challenges are shared, but the solutions should be very specific and we can optimize them through the studying of the specific cases. And as you can see from the names, the cities are very different in their scale, in their geographical and traditional climatic conditions, but also the areas that we are studying in Belgrade. Two of them, one is a new park that has been developed over the abandoned railway infrastructure, and also another park that is already existing, quite popular in the city, but we are trying to make an evidence that by introducing the advanced technology, we can improve and constantly enhance the questions related to public health and well-being through the nature-based solution monitoring and intervention. We have northern city of Gladsaxe in Denmark, much smaller in a scale than Belgrade, but still with not only problems of related to climate, but also related to social status of the area that we are studying and their little integration with the surrounding neighborhoods. So we are trying to make an evidence that through the nature-based solution, we can tackle not only environmental elements of the city's functioning, but also the social one, which are important. We have southern representative from Greece, Piraeus, with three very different areas, and also the city of Łódź in Poland. Having in the first part of the project, where we are now studied and analyze very detailed the context and created the knowledge of what are the conditions of the places we are working with. We also performed the assessment through different modeling phases of what is the current baseline status and what other alternatives could bring. What is the combination of nature-based solution, maybe not only one, but the combination of those, what could really bring to the spaces we are dealing with that already have their own potential and resources. So the analytical process is not only to evidence the gaps, but also to find the potential elements that could flourish, that could really improve the space. And here are some examples of works performed in Belgrade, Gladsaxe, and Łódź. But another very important aspect is the dialogue with not only the experts, as I said, that we work with in each city, but also with citizens. So the knowledge of the space and the needs and concerns of the end users of the spaces we are dealing with. So we created this base of dialogue with different methodologies, through the questionnaires, through the semi-structured interviews, but also through series of workshops we are performing in each city. And here you see one of the examples in Belgrade. And this really helped us to improve the knowledge and to understand better what is the vision from the people who use it, and really to explain them also our vision, but mostly to learn from their experience from the place. And this combination of experts' work, of dialogue with citizens, give us a mapping of the concerns and issues in each of the spaces. And we, of course, look at them through different groups, the social, economic, environmental, urban, like physical design elements. What are those concerns linked to accessibility to the space, to the lack of some elements, or the excess of others, or to really concerns of the perception of the space, like safety or some very concrete environmental problems linked to the risk of flooding and so on. And once we have all these concerns, we can see each of the demo sites we are looking at and understand which is the dominant concern, which is the scoring of different, and try to overlap this screening of concerns with the choice of nature-based solutions, and to understand if there is a specific combination, like from the menu of different solutions that we can offer, but is there a specific combination that is really reflecting the context where we are working? And this is the example at this moment when we are at the designing the solution and starting in the following months to implement them, is to link the concerns and link expected outcomes of the MBS interventions to have the benefits that we expect, that are connected with, of course, air pollutants, with the, as I said, the perception of the place, protection of the direct sun, and different environmental and social aspects that are characteristic for this specific place. And once we make this analysis of the MBS and their benefits, then we choose the ideal combination, expected ideal combination for the benefits, and start with the implementation of them. Another thing is that we really continuously share the expertise and share our work, also because we believe that through sharing and through knowing the experience also that other cities are going through in the transforming the planning process for ever-changing conditions, we can learn and better find together the solutions for the specific local needs, but it can have an effect on a bigger scale until the tackling the climate change mitigation, which is really very important for the safety and public health of the cities that we are working in. Thank you very much for your attention.
Hi, everyone. I'm Pernilla Holtedal. I'm a research fellow at the Center for Climate Finance and Investment here at the Business School. And I will be speaking to you. I've been asked today the question of how do we get more financial investments into nature? And that is a great question. And when I say great, I mean in both senses of the word, of it being a very good question, but also a very big question. It's the one I spend most of my time thinking about here at Imperial. Over the past couple of years, I would say there's been an awakening in the financial sector and the corporate sector about nature. So businesses have started realizing how much they need nature. It's been sort of coming as a result of the awakening first to climate change and then to nature. But I would say that mostly this has been couched in terms of risks. So how is nature, or the lack of nature, or the fact that nature is deteriorating, a risk to my business? And it is a risk because there have been studies, and people have attempted putting numbers on this. And a couple of years ago, the World Economic Forum estimated that half of the world's GDP, or about $44 trillion US, depends directly on nature, which is obviously a huge number. The question about, you know, increasingly then businesses have been asked to think about how can they take better care of nature, how can they lessen the impact, etc. What I'm more interested in, although the first question about risk is incredibly important, is on the opportunity side, so sort of the flip side of that. How can we actually invest and improve nature, not just manage the risks around it for our own benefit? I think I'll go to the next slide. I actually just have 2 slides. You can see here a beautiful valley in Colombia, in South America. And I'm trying to show to you the various values and benefits nature produces. And I've presented those in sort of white shaded areas. So obviously trees, we know they purify the air, produce precipitation, they absorb CO2. Trees and grasslands at the bottom of this valley prevent soil erosion. They filter the water, they improve the water quality and the quantity. Obviously, forests are the habitats for a lot of biodiversity, both plant life and animal life, etc. What I've put in blue are the areas or those services that we can convert somehow into money, into some kind of benefit for a business. And although this does a very poor job at showing that one is bigger than the other, I will think of next time a visual diagram to show you that the areas in white are much, much bigger than the areas in blue. So what we are able to convert into financial or monetary value in today's economy is a very small subset of the total value of benefits that nature produces. And so I've done in a very expert way, illustrated this with dollar size to make it clear that the blue areas. And so, for instance, you may be familiar with carbon offsets or carbon credits linked to trees. That's something that can be traded in the market. There's a system that has existed, or a way of transacting environmental services called payment for ecosystem services. It's been around for about 30 years in a number of countries. It works sometimes, and sometimes it doesn't work. We haven't been able to scale them. Basically, that's when an upstream producer of a service, let's say a farmer, does something to reduces use of fertilizer so that the water improves, and the water plant downstream can then doesn't have to invest in additional cleaning facilities instead. Okay, so that's an example. And then the downstream facility will pay the upstream farmer. That's a payment direct transaction between two parties. Sounds wonderful, I love it, but it turns out in practice that there have been problems. People are complex, systems are complex, nature is complex, so it's not straightforward. Ecotourism is another way of turning nature into something we can make money off, and not make money off in a sort of negative, sinister way, but something where we can have a nice eco lodge. People come, look at the biodiversity, you create local employment at the same time. So great, but again, there's a limit to how much you can do of that. And then we also have products like sustainably grown commodities. So shade-grown coffee tastes better. I'm not sure I've been able to taste the difference, but I think maybe some of you have. So basically, that's coffee that's being grown and where in the shade of other larger trees. It's much better for the environment. It has lots of better benefits, and we're able to convert it into that benefit into money because we charge a slightly higher price for it in the market. So somebody can make money off it. So this is the core question really today is how do we turn more of the white areas into blue areas if we want to work within the system? Or to put it sort of in more formal terms, how do we turn more of the intrinsic value of nature into monetary value? What I'd like to get across to you today, and maybe that's the most important thing I'd like to go home with, is that it's not so much a question of finance as it is of economics. And I don't know how familiar you are with the distinction between the two, but economics is about the underlying business model. The finance is just about how to get money into it. The finance is there. There is no shortage of money in the world today. We need to think about how to get that, how that money wants to go to those areas. Okay, and that's about the underlying business model or the economic model. So that's where really the challenge lies. Private investors need a return. That's what private investors do, or a corporation like a Coca-Cola company, Unilever. They need to somehow justify their expense. They will always spend some money on sort of voluntary purposes, or charitable donations, but that's tiny. We need much larger sums than that. So, so that's basically the question is, will it, one of those questions is, or rather question I will put back to the question of can we get more private finance into nature? My answer will be yes, we can, but will it be enough? That's one question too, that follow-up question, if you will. Currently, the sums don't add up. So we put out a study at the CCFI in October called Can Market Save Nature? And we looked at nature instruments, so investments in nature in a given year, and we added those up to be on the global basis to about $41 billion US. Another report that many have quoted from the Paulson Institute states that about between 600 and 700 billion are needed annually. So it's a fraction of what's currently needed is actually happening. So currently we're not able to we're not able to provide the necessary finance. Question is, can we scale it up? And in our report, we point out some enabling conditions for how to do this. And of course, there are things that can be done in terms of improving metrics, engaging the local community. But like I said, the underlying business model has to work, and there needs to be a return. That's the key requirement to get more private investments in. The other question is, we have to make sure we make these investments in the correct way. Nature is very fragile. My colleagues have pointed out many of the complexities of nature. So if you start tinkering with one piece of nature, you may end up damaging other bits. It's much more difficult to invest in nature and to do something to nature than to a piece of equipment. So we have to be mindful of that. And we have seen, probably in the news, you've seen that, you know, there are carbon projects that have had negative consequence for people or negative consequence for other things. So we have to be very careful about that. So nature is very complex. We have to make sure, if we try to scale up private investments, that we do it in the correct way, bringing everybody on board and making sure we not damage the rest of the environment. So I guess I will sort of stop here, because I think the question about how to generate more, I've said, I've suggested how we can generate more, but I've also posed 2 additional questions, which is, will it be enough? And can we do it the right way? So I think I will leave it there. Just so you know, we concluded in the report with the question, we answered the question, can markets save nature, with not yet and never on their own. There's an incredibly important role for the public sector. There are lots and lots of aspects of nature that private money will not go towards because it just doesn't make sense. So the public sector has an incredibly important role. And I think there's a lot missing right now in terms of government level engagement in many countries. Is that?
Hi everyone, testing. I'm Halima, and I was part of the academia and research delegation at COP, along with 4 of my other colleagues who are here. And today I will speak to you about the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, also known as the GBF, what happened at COP, some of my personal thoughts, and the outcomes, I guess, of COP. Some of you may have known about COP, mostly the climate COP, which happened in Egypt last year and in Glasgow the previous year. This is a different type of COP. It was the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is what CBD stands for. And just like its sister convention on climate change, it's governed by the Conference of Parties, which is what COP stands for also. And this was the 15th meeting in Montreal. Oh, and so I'll just give you a quick rundown on the history of the CBD, sorry. And so the topic of environmental degradation started gaining global recognition. This is for example, acid rain was an issue in pollution. And so in 1992, the CBD opens up for signatures at the UN conference on the human environment. This is also known as the Rio Summit. And in 93, the CBD signed by 168 member states, excluding the USA, which is still apparent today. And the main objectives were to conserve biodiversity, encourage a sustainable use of its components, and ensure the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from it. And since then, there's been 15 Conference of the Parties where all member states come together to review the progress made under the conventions. And in 2010, we had this 10-year target, which was supposed to be reached by 2020. And we had a set of global targets, and there was 20 of them that focus on the underlying causes of biodiversity loss and promoting sustainable use and safeguarding ecosystems and enhancing ecosystem services, as well as expanding on capacity building. You may be familiar with this because none of these targets were actually reached, unfortunately, and that's what the 5th Global Biodiversity Outlook told us in 2020. So the state of biodiversity now, which has really been emphasized today, is the number of threatened species have never been higher. And yes, we are in a global dying planet. And so 2022 happened, and last year my colleagues and I, we went to COP15, and this was hosted by China, co-hosted by China and Canada, but because of the pandemic, it was 2 years late in the making. So, okay. What happened at COP? I mean, I could stay here for ages and tell you what happened at COP because there was just so much happening. But basically, member states came together to deliberate and try and agree on a set of targets. And negotiations happened in this room, and they chose Microsoft Word and track changes. And there was a lot of conflict and issues around agreeing on specific targets because if you don't know this, the UN is based on a consensus basis, and each one and every party member state has a right to veto. So if one person doesn't agree, then nobody agrees, and you'd have to go back to deliberating until somebody comes to an agreement. So these negotiations would go on until the evening, and it was in a dark room. It was, quite onerous and tiring. But ultimately, we came to a conclusion, and so many long sentences, so I'm not going to read out this whole thing, but ultimately the GBF looked at to take urgent action to halt and reverse biodiversity loss and put nature on a path to recovery. You may have also heard about the 30 by 30 slogan, and this just rang through the whole way through, and it looked at restoring 30% of degraded ecosystems on land and sea whilst conserving and managing 30% of the world's ecosystems. A lot of scientists actually argue that this isn't enough, but I guess it's a start somewhere. There was a lot of conflict and issue also around Target 19, which was the funding mechanism, but then this actually didn't make it into the package afterwards. So there's this Global Environmental Fund, which was set up in 1993, where developed countries had to give money to developing countries that had high biodiversity. And China and Brazil were one of the main beneficiaries of this fund. And a lot of people at COP, a lot of member states at COP15 felt that China and Brazil already developed, so they should start contributing. And other developing nations felt that there needed to be a separate mechanism and more funding needed to be provided for any of these targets to be implemented. But a second 30 by 30 goal made it into the final package, which is good news. It's a good start. So the outcomes of COP, an agreement was reached, which is pretty incredible because almost 200 countries actually agreed on something, which is, I don't even know how that happened, but it did, which was incredible. But also it was the first time that indigenous knowledge was given sufficient attention, and indigenous peoples and local communities were recognized as custodians of biodiversities, and so many targets that included them in that. Developed countries recognize the obligation to provide money to poorer nations to help protect and restore nature. And individual countries have also agreed to action targets by reporting and reviewing the voluntary increasing ambitions for tackling biodiversity losses in their respective countries. But there was also a lot of negatives, and this is just some of them. But a lot of people have argued that some of the targets are too vague and they require measurable biodiversity indicators to ensure they're met. And at present, it's the technology, some would say, is in its infancy. There's a lot more needs to be done to see whether these targets are actually on track or not. And also because the commitments are non-binding legally, and there's a history of biodiversity targets not leading to sufficient action. For example, the Aichi targets, where none of them were met. And also with respect to the funding mechanism, the £30 billion agreed, there's a lot of uncertainty around whether developed countries will actually honor this or not, given the track record of developed countries not honoring financial pledges. And I'll leave you some of my personal thoughts and some pictures. For me, it was quite overwhelming being there. I mean, after reading just how policymaking happens on papers and in journals, seeing it happen in person was incredible, but it was also quite overwhelming because there was just so many things happening at once and a lot of, conflict within the negotiation rooms, and some developing countries and island states weren't really given the voice on many occasions. And on the last day, which is the bottom left picture, you can see a lot of people asleep. So we were waiting for around 7 hours, I think, and every other hour they would, delay it by another hour. And then at 3 a.m. there was a final agreement that came through, and at that point, everybody, including myself, was delirious. And we were given, I think, 20 minutes or half an hour just to go through the final draft text. And then, yeah, the presidency just gaveled it through, and here we are today. And yeah, this was us doing a pretend huddle, but we were all quite, sleep deprived at that point. And I will leave you with this quote by the one and only Antonio Guterres: "The deluded dreams of billionaires aside, there is no planet B." So any billionaires in the room, listen up. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to all of our wonderful speakers. I learned a lot by listening, so I enjoyed that, as I'm sure all of you did. So now we're going to be taking questions. I'm going to start off with at least 3 questions from the room, and then we'll move on to some of the questions that we're getting online. So does anyone have something to ask a member of our panel? Yes.
Yeah, hi, I'm Michael from CCFI, colleague of 10 years. I have a question for Alina. On COP15, how much of a presence was there from the finance industry and investment industry? So I know the climate COP is a huge presence now from the finance industry. What would you say on COP15?
I'm just going to repeat for Zoom.
Okay.
The question was there a presence of the finance industry at the COP?
There was a massive presence from finance and business at COP. And actually, I thought it was a good thing. I mean, to try and typically, I mean, I've been told I'm a negative Nelly at times, but I think it was nice to see business and finance, and even some of them were even in negotiation rooms, and they would put up their hands at some points just to try and enhance the deliberation process. But there was a lot of people from everywhere in finance trying to implement their agenda into biodiversity, which arguably could be seen as a good or bad thing. But there was a big presence.
Yes.
My question is also for Camila, and I was wondering why there was U.S. not a party to the convention.
The question is why the U.S. isn't a party to COP.
Oh, okay. Yeah, the US is not a party at all. In 1993, actually, Bill Clinton tried to actually sign the CBD on behalf of the US, but in the US, you need 2/3 of the Senate to actually pass any international agreement. So that hasn't been done. The science community has been long urging them to be a member state, but I think their argument is that they have their own environmental protection agency. But they are there, they were present, they go around and they lobby and whisper in their friends' ears to get things happen. But yeah.
Yes.
My question is not for Alina.
Okay.
For the other 3. I was thinking while listening to you all as to whether in your work you consider kind of cultural differences in how people relate to nature, and kind of whether there's an acknowledgement in your work as to how, for example, how some cultures are much more closely connected to nature, or how in Stanislava's work, you're kind of talking about different people and how they relate to the environment, whether there's a difference between men and women and safety factors, for example, among these environments. Or do all of your works sort of assume a single average person? What allowances do you make for that?
So for our Zoom friends, the question is, does your work consider cultural differences in attitudes to nature?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. It's a very important one. One of the group of experts we are working with is also from social sciences institutes that are very focused on these questions. And there is a difference between perception of space, tangible and intangible differences of the perception of space for genders, also for different age of people and their feeling of the space. So Yes, we do it both from a scientific point of view, but also when collecting the knowledge from the citizens and end users, we do learn a lot about that and consider it and try to implement in a specific culturally different space the knowledge we earn from that. Thank you.
Yeah, completely agree. I think there's a lot of different research focused on the mental health benefits of green space in sort of Western countries, I think in Europe and America. And I think really there is quite a lot of evidence too, though, in other places such as China. You know, there's a big body of research there. So really you get that kind of differences in the cultural, you know, how different cultures might respond to, you know, interactions with nature through those studies being in different places in the world as well. There is a lot of information that could be gained in places like sub-Saharan Africa. I think there's like maybe less than 10 or 5 studies in that context, and obviously, you know, that's potentially a very important benefit in those places. And also, as you say, maybe not, you know, the cultural differences might mean that the benefits that they get are completely different. So I think it's definitely on the research agenda. And even in the UK, you know, there'll be studies that will look at benefits for different socioeconomic groups, for example, and a lot of studies show that more deprived areas will disproportionately benefit from green interventions too. I think that's kind of integrated a little bit into policy as well from some sort of policy documents that the government produces as well.
I would say in terms of the investment community, it's probably not been taken very much into account for a long time, but increasingly so because projects fail. When projects happen in nature usually there are people around it. So if you don't integrate the values and the ways of life and the way of thinking and get them on board, the projects will fail. So I think there's increasingly now, for instance, in the carbon credit, carbon offset industry, most standards, etc., now include indigenous peoples. They're quite rigorous in terms of including those voices for tropical countries, for instance. Even here in the UK, we've seen tree planting projects, for instance, in Wales, which create a lot of resistance from certain farming communities. And so there's been a backlash, and now I think they're rejigging it. So we haven't been good enough until now, but I think it's happening.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you look at look at the literature on genders and environmental policies, more women and, you know, Black and minority ethnic groups or, you know, marginalized groups that are willing to uptake these new environmental policies. And within the context of what happened at COP, there was increasing recognitions of women's, youth, even religious groups. And I think, just like you said, there isn't enough happening, but I'm starting to see that there is something happening. Like they've been included in these major multilateral agreements. So I think there's some hope. Yeah.
Fantastic. Do we have any questions from online?
Yeah, we have a question from Margaret Heath, and she asks, what needs to be done to get business to pressure government policymakers to get real about climate change and biodiversity loss for the long-term impact of the UK?
How can we get business to do this? Any thoughts?
Yeah. I would almost flip the question around. I don't think it's business responsibility. Well, it can be, but I don't think it's the most effective way. Business are created, at least within the system we live today, to make a profit and to make money. So they will do that within the remit that they're allowed to operate in within the law. So of course they also starting to have other motives, but I think it's incredibly important for us, the people, to vote for the right people. That's policymakers should be influenced mostly by us, the voters, and less so by businesses, because then we're going towards lobbyism and sort of more the corporate system in the US, which is not particularly healthy for democracy. But of course, you know, I think there's a limit to what we can expect from businesses. And also if a business today says, oh, I want to invest in this lovely nature reserve. If it's not in the long-term interest of that business to keep it up, it won't keep it up. So we need to align incentives so that what's good for the business is also good for the world. That ultimately has to do with incentives and policy making.
One more question from Sahir Khan. He asks, what technological developments are most needed to meet the current gaps regarding key biodiversity indicators?
I'm not too much of an expert on that, but increasing technologies that look at monitoring, for example, and increasing R&D investments in R&D for indicators, because right now we need more indicators to be able to see whether how much we're on track, and for example, investing in drones to look at how many species are in X, Y, and Z places, investing more money and technology into developing countries that need to be able to look at how much biodiversity they have. That's important, but I'm not too familiar. Anyone else?
Yes, just of course, agree there are technologies that could improve, like for example, wastewater treatment plants, advanced new plants that can be incorporated easily and in a much smaller scale than it was before, that can improve actually environmental conditions and therefore biodiversity in the spaces we work with. So yes, there are many improvements that we should incorporate and monitor, and then hopefully confirm their benefit.
I would say we have lots of technology that can help us detect signals of biodiversity, like for instance, acoustic monitoring devices, so we can hear what a forest sounds like. What we are more limited by is our ability to say, what does a healthy forest sound like? What's our baseline? And that is partially research, partially indigenous and cultural knowledge, but it's going to take a lot more than just technological investment. That's just a piece in the portfolio. All right. Well, guys, thank you so much for your attention. And thank you so much to the panelists for such fabulous insights. And we'll hope to see you at the next Sustainability Week event. We have them running all the rest of the week. So thank you, guys.